Hi, everyone. This is Mergers and Acquisitions, a podcast by the Society for Economic Anthropology, where we dive into all things economic anthropology and beyond. I'm Aneil Tripathy, and as an economic and climate anthropologist myself, I'm very excited today to be joined by Pamela McElwee, an associate professor in the Department of Human Ecology at Rutgers University. Now, for the first 15 years, her research interests have concerned human adaptation to global environmental change, with a particular expertise in biodiversity conservation and climate change in Asia. Pam's work focuses on how individuals and households respond to changes in the physical environment and how their responses are shaped by external policies, markets, and other constraints as well. Her research combines qualitative and quantitative household-level social analysis of environmental decision-making and resource use, with most of her fieldwork focusing on Vietnam. She has also been a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Pam is the author of Anthropological Engagements with Integrated Assessment Modeling, an Economic Anthropology Symposium issue on climate change. So thank you so much for being here today, Pam.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So since this is a podcast for the Society for Economic Anthropology, my first question shouldn't be too much of a surprise. What is economic anthropology to you, and what is this subdiscipline all about?
For me, it really intersects with my interest in understanding value very broadly defined. So for example, I do a lot of work on ecosystem services, of which climate services is an important component, but I look at a lot of other ecosystem services as well, from water to the value of biodiversity, to have genetic diversity into the future. And a lot of my work involves trying to figure out how different people attach value to those services. And of course, for a lot of folks, attaching a monetary value to an economic service is the way to go, because it potentially helps figure out how externalities can be avoided and provides incentives to, say, reduce pollution. But of course, that's very controversial. There's a lot of work by anthropologists talking about the commodification of nature. And so part of my research has been, are there ways to assess value that don't lead to commodification, or at least lead to commodification in which participation by affected parties can be improved? So basically, it's thinking about all the different ways people value things, both monetarily and through non-market value, and figure out how shifts in those values affect both the physical environment, but also how policies can help either facilitate better valuing, and again, not necessarily a market value, but some sort of way to recognize existing values that people hold for their environment. So that shapes a lot of my thinking, and certainly around climate change, the concept of value and how do we understand all the different types of values we attach to a livable world is a really rich area of research.
And one thing I really like about your work, right, and your piece in economic anthropology in the symposium issue is your call to really have an economic anthropology that's really in the midst of these conversations, in a sense, these global conversations that we're having that are directly changing or producing the response that we have to climate change. So you've been involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. You have a piece in Anthropology News, which I think is really great, the Social Life of Climate reports back in April 2020. And I'm really kind of struck by a lot of threads in your work, particularly this kind of attempt to figure out how, as anthropologists, we're both already active in these spaces, but then also how can we really try to expand and kind of open the conversation about other ways of thinking about perhaps what our response to climate change will be, relating to what you were saying economic anthropology is for you, right? Trying to open up different ways of looking at our material world beyond commodification, for instance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of my work, particularly with the IPCC and on climate change, is wearing multiple hats. I mean, on one hand, I've been an author, and so my job was to assess anthropological literatures and to bring a social science sensibility to some of the chapters that I was working on. And so, for example, I worked on the IPCC Climate Change and Land report, and the chapter that I was working on was primarily biophysical scientists assessing the various carbon sequestration options that we have around land, from soils to forests to wetlands and so forth, and thinking about how those could be compared, and does that give us any indication of where we should invest in terms of policy. And so, of course, as a social scientist, I was also, hopefully bringing to the fore things like we need to know more about forests than just their carbon content, right? We need to know what the land tenure situation is. We need to know how people value these forests beyond the obvious answer of timber. And if we started valuing carbon in different ways, whether it's a market for carbon or subsidy for carbon, that needs to reflect the fact that different people provide different values. And it's very difficult to do that sometimes in policy. So I was trying to sort of bring that anthropological sensibility to some of the findings of the reports themselves. But then I was also very much wearing my hat as a practicing anthropologist and looking at this as a sort of field site where people were doing things that were unfamiliar to me. And I wanted to understand more about these epistemic communities that form within the climate change assessment world. And, what do they do? What are the assumptions they make? How do they view their own work? And so that part of that, led me to become more and more interested in integrated assessment models, because those have been very prominent in some of the most recent IPCC reports, and not without controversy. And so thinking about it from an anthropologist's angle, why were they controversial? What's in those models that particularly economic anthropologists would probably disagree with? How could we improve them? Maybe we should discard them. Maybe we should do something else. But those were all the questions that were sort of animating my thinking about IAMs as part of the climate change assessment report process.
One thing that struck me in your description of these models, what these reports do, is also the notion of consensus knowledge, which I think seems really key here. And I think gets at some of the difficulties sometimes anthropologists, at least from my experiences, seem to have getting their ideas out into the broader world, into the policy world, and also into the public at large. Because I think, right, in our discipline, we're very well trained in a kind of a mode of critiquing or reflecting on the world. But then I think there are a lot of difficulties when some of us try to use that knowledge in a kind of a political sphere or a sphere that's outside of academia, right? Because we get into these difficulties, as you're saying, in terms of the tensions that we may see in these modeling processes that may then also make us likely to not really want to fully engage or try to engage with these systems at all. How do you see yourself trying to balance between these critiques and engagement?
Yeah, I think the question of critique is not unique to anthropology. I think those of us in academia, whether we're anthropologists or not, often get that everything is just, why the world doesn't work in a simplistic way. And any scientist you talk to who works on climate will joke that, if they go to a policymaker and a policymaker asks them a direct question, oftentimes the response is, well, it depends, right? We say that all the time.
Yeah.
And I obviously anthropologists, because we work so intimately and closely in specific communities, we're often wary of overgeneralizing, whereas other disciplines, I think, are much more comfortable with going ahead and making generalizations. And so part of that, I think, as anthropologists, is not shying away from talking in general terms. I mean, you can always put the caveat, this is based on my work, which involves, these parameters, these communities, this particular context, but not being afraid to make larger generalizations. I mean, give an example, economists do it all the time, right? Economists do a lot of studies which are based on undergraduates at their particular university, and they'll make universal claims from those studies. And so we as anthropologists shouldn't be afraid to make potential generalizations, particularly when they're policy relevant. So to give an example, I'm, as I mentioned, really interested in ecosystem services. And one of the things that I think has become pretty clear over the years from my work in Asia, but then sort of thinking about ecosystem services policy more generally, is that one potential way to get around the problem of people not wanting to commodify nature, which is a very valid concern, is to think instead about the labor that goes into producing ecosystem services services and commodifying that. Because labor in most parts of the world is already commodified, right? Most people work in wage labor systems. And so if we think about all the things that people do that require labor for which they then get ecosystem services in return, whether it's, digging a canal to access water, or it's clearing brush in a forest to have, a healthier forest stands. There's a lot of labor that goes into ecosystem services. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is, when we think about payments for ecosystem services programs and things like that, what if we framed the value that people put into ecosystem services via labor and compensate people for that, as opposed to saying, you are buying a credit for water, or you are buying a credit for these trees. So in some ways that sort of circumvents some of the very valid problems that people have with thinking about, being able to buy nature and turn it into something that's perfectly substitutable with a value someplace else. But it's thinking about labor, because that's a market that's has exchange value that's very common, that people are used to already. So it's kind of thinking in those terms. Like, all of those studies I've done are very specific to my field work, but I think they have that broader generalization that I can make, that labor should be something we should think about within payments for ecosystem services policies.
I think that's a great example of how you can use anthropology in a sense to broaden the conversation, right? And do it in a way that's also very much aware or cognizant of what are people used to, what are communities already engaged in, and how can we kind of work with that instead of use this other economized kind of financial approach to create some diversity of approach. And also, I think what's valuable there is showing that obviously there are generalizations that are happening in that model, but that's a form of knowledge that's as legitimate as when we're doing critiques and other ways of trying to make sense of these systems, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're taking advantage of the fact that in most places in the world, a labor market already exists. You're not creating something from scratch. And of course, it'll have all sorts of problems. Labor will be undervalued. Women's labor in households is, of course, never compensated in the same ways. But at least you're working with something that's familiar. And so you're not trying to introduce something wholesale, which has all sorts of complications, like, what is the value of carbon sequestration in monetary terms to a community, when we know that, carbon sequestration, you have to think about the long-term benefits. What happens if a fire breaks out and it's nobody's fault? Who's gonna, is somebody gonna get punished for that because they've all of a sudden, lost their carbon credits for the year? There's all sorts of complications with ecosystem services markets that maybe can be circumvented slightly if we think about it in terms of people's interaction with the environment, rather than the market just kind of skipping over people and going straight to the ecosystem service.
So I was wondering if maybe you could give us a bit of the trajectory of how you got to this really cool place in your career. When you initially started studying anthropology, what were the questions you were interested in? When did you first started thinking about economic anthropology? What do you feel were the different stages as you've come up into the field?
Yeah, I was actually accepted for a PhD in forestry at Yale. So I started off, and the Yale Forestry School has a sort of long history of social science, but I started off very embedded in the environment side of things. I ended up adding a joint degree with the anthropology department 2 years into my PhD or something. Throughout my dissertation, I was extremely interested in just sort of the economic changes that were resulting in changes in environmental value and use and so forth in Vietnam, because I think a lot of my thinking about the importance of economics is shaped by the fact that I was doing fieldwork in Vietnam in the late 1990s, where Vietnam was shifting out of this cooperative socialist market to a market system in a very interesting way. People were, getting land rights again that had formerly been in cooperatives. There was a lot of lack of clarity about land tenure. What are the implications of all these changes going to be on, how people interact with their environment? And at the time, my dissertation was about near a protected area. So the dissertation itself was about all the challenges of managing a protected area in the context of these economic changes that are happening sort of outside. And so I did a lot of household surveys. I mean, household surveys have been sort of fundamental method for me. And I almost always ask about income and expenditures, because I'm really interested in how people think about what's valuable to them, what they want to spend their money on, what they earn from various activities. I think these are always fascinating. And one of the great things is that survey that I did when I was doing my dissertation, which was in the year 2000, I went back in 2019 and I was able to, my original household survey was 105 households or so. And I went back 2 summers ago and I resurveyed everybody. And I only had, 5 or 6 households that I couldn't find because they'd moved away and so forth or passed away. And basically resurveyed them to see, what was going on, what had been the big economic changes that had been going on. And massive differences in terms of new sources of income. There had been a real shift from people relying on the resources of the protected area in the form of non-timber forest products and other things they were collecting and selling. And that had almost entirely gone away 20 years later and been replaced by sending children abroad to work in export processing zones in other parts of Asia, so South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. And those remittances had almost entirely replaced their environmental income. And so that's the sort of thing that you couldn't have predicted 20 years ago necessarily. What is going to replace this dependency that people had on the environment? And so that was really fascinating to watch that transition over time. And so the work that I was thinking about doing after the dissertation has been moving more towards thinking about ecosystem services, thinking about climate change. And a lot of that was a function of actually seeing the physical impacts of climate change more prominently in Vietnam, starting in about 2005 or so. And so I have done some work in different parts of Vietnam, thinking about the sort of large-scale climate impacts that households are experiencing, different types of household vulnerabilities. So I've done a lot on that. And then it was in 2016, I guess, when I started working as a lead author on the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES, the sort of biodiversity equivalent to IPCC. So I worked on that report. Then I worked on the IPCC report on land. And so those were just totally new realms for me to kind of think about large scale assessments and different disciplines working together, and then the policy ramifications of that. So that's been a fun direction. And I'm right in the middle right now of working on a joint IPCC IPBES report. They've never done a joint report before, but as people increasingly recognize that, climate and biodiversity are basically two sides of the same coin. Why do we have these completely separate UN processes for them, both in terms of the science assessments, but also in terms of the policy? That they decided to do a joint report. And so we were supposed to all meet in person last spring. And of course, it's all been remote, but that's ongoing. And so that'll be an interesting way to sort of bring multiple of my interests together.
That's great. And I think it's a really good example of, I think, a lot of the value in anthropology of having kind of a longue durée connection to a particular field site, where you're then able to go back decades later and see what has changed and kind of put that in relation to what you were thinking then and what you're working on now. Similarly for me, working in climate finance, I've only been in the space for 6 years, but I've already seen tremendous change in seeing organizations with just 4 people grow to 70 globally, and these climate finance markets also grow dramatically. Yeah. So I think as also what you're doing in terms of now bringing your expertise into the conversations at the UN in these reports, it's another good example too of how, as anthropologists, we can be very locally knowledgeable, but then use that knowledge in a more comparative or broader scope.
Yeah, I think we could certainly try, and I think there's interest in that as well. So I had a chance in November to do some advising to the Framework Convention on Climate Change preparatory meetings. So there was supposed to be a big climate change meeting last fall. This was the 5 years post-Paris stock taking. Countries were going to make more, hopefully more ambitious pledges. Everything got pushed back. So the big meeting is next year in Glasgow. But there was a November meeting in November 2020 to basically talk about, what do we need to think about moving forward to kind of keep the momentum going. And so some folks who had worked on IPCC reports were asked to be present at those meetings to answer questions from the political delegations about anything that came up, anything that they might want to know about as they're making these potentially more ambitious pledges. And so I got a question from one of the EU countries delegate who basically was saying, can we put a cost figure on delay? Like what is the cost figure for delaying any sort of policy action, by 1 year, 10 years, 5 years, whatever. And so some of the modelers who had used integrated assessment models could give a rough estimation that, they thought that there were going to be X billion, $100 billion worth of damage. Dramatic reduction in carbon emissions didn't happen by 2030. And then other folks were able to say, well, we've had X amount of damages, like just in the US, for example, in 2020, we had more than $20 billion damages, like the total amount of damages from climate events, hurricanes, floods, droughts, all that was something on the order of 200, 300 million in just the US alone last year. And so we had some folks had the figures for that sort of worldwide. So you can either look back, what's been the estimate of damages, you can look forward, you can try to model. And I jumped in and I said, yes, there are those figures, but I want everyone to remember all of the things that are not included in those figures. And those things include the value of being able to send your kids to school uninterrupted. And of course, that hit home with everybody in the pandemic. The value of being able to live in an unpolluted environment, the value of not being displaced, basically talked about all the potential non-market values that are never captured in any of these sort of large-scale estimations. And I sort of saw heads nodding on the Zoom screen. It was a sort of reminder that every type of vulnerability is ultimately experienced in a single place, and those places are irreplaceable to the people who live there. And so you can never quantify it in ways that policymakers wanted it to be quantified. But I think they heard that they always have to remind themselves that whatever number they get, whether it's damages or projected damages, is 100% inaccurate in the sense that it excludes all of these things that they in fact value.
So in these conversations, right, particularly as the years go on with climate change and we see larger and larger effects and the scenarios don't really seem to be looking much better times, what are things that make you optimistic in terms of the conversations we're having globally and the possibilities we have to really have a real response to climate change that can create alternative futures or futures with possibility?
Yeah, I mean, for years, people have said, probably what's going to happen with climate change is it's not, at least in terms of response to climate change, it's not going to be sort of incremental policies, which is what folks had suggested maybe 10 years ago, like let's do a little bit here, a little bit there. It was very much kind of the Obama administration's approach to climate change, frankly. Let's do a little bit here and there where we can. But other folks were saying, it's much more likely to be you reach a tipping point. And at that point, there's going to be a lot of action all at once. And it's probably going to be driven by partially, changes in the market. If you think back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people were talking about, oh, gas is so much cheaper. Like that's going to help us get away from coal. Now we're talking about not using fossil fuels at all. Like that's part of the conversation. That's something that the current president of the United States is talking about his ultimate goal. So I think we're getting to a tipping point where things could come very quickly. They could change very rapidly and much more quickly than we think we know. I mean, I just got a push notification on my phone today that General Motors is going to phase out all fossil fuel internal combustion engine motors in 15 years. So I mean, you couldn't have predicted that, I think, just even 5 years ago. And so if they do it, of course, other ones are going to do it as well. And so is it going to be on time? I'd like it to be faster, sure. But that's the sort of tipping point that I think people rightly recognize, that if you get a critical mass of folks saying, we have to use zero fossil fuels, not bridges, not, up till 2050, like it has to be zero faster, then you potentially can get those sort of tipping points. So yeah, I mean, I mean, you have to be optimistic if you work in the climate space. If you aren't, then you'd hardly get out of bed in the morning. Yeah. So I just try to look for the things that are working.
No, completely. Also, I was wondering, so in the first mergers and acquisitions episode that we did, it was with archaeologist Vern Scarborough, another one of the authors in the symposium, who's also done a lot of collaborative multidisciplinary work with others who aren't anthropologists. And so I was asking him, what are some of his strategies to work with people in different disciplines, create these collaborations, and also, I think in your case, also, working with policymakers. Do you have any particular strategies? One of his was humor. right?
Mm.
Using humor to try to
Yeah.
break the ice and create collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always try to at least understand where other people are coming from. I've had some natural scientists tell me that they have been put off by social scientists and anthropologists in particular, who they feel are kind of attacking science. And so I always approach it with, I think, a very strong critique of scientific practices and assumptions that are not backed up with evidence and so forth. So I was sort of grounded in something that people can kind of understand. And I always try to figure out what other people are doing. Most people don't know what anthropologists do, right? So we can try to educate folks as best we can. But I like to know what the economist is doing. I like to know what the paleoceanographer is doing. And that helps me talk to them. Obviously I'm not going to understand everything that folks are doing, but at least I want to know what the questions they're asking are and what are the methods they're using. So I try to read quite widely if I can in interdisciplinary journals, like Nature Sustainability, which will have folks from all sorts of different backgrounds potentially publishing in. I'm sitting on the advisory board for this new journal, One Earth, which has a very similar approach, which is lots of different ways of thinking about problems from lots of different disciplines. And, it's nice to be able to talk to one another. So I think that helps. I think, just sort of taking the time and figuring out, what are the big questions that are animating other folks in the climate space. And then hopefully we can have a conversation going forward from there.
Do you think your kind of training, also the Yale School of Forestry, also really kind of primed you to kind of work across disciplines? I know in my research, I've spent quite a bit of time between the Yale School of Management and Forestry, because in the climate finance space, those institutions have worked quite well together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've always sort of toggled between the sort of biological sciences and social sciences. So as an undergraduate, I was a poli-sci and environmental studies major, even though my primary advisor at that point was Steve Hamburg, who's actually quite well known now. He works with the Environmental Defense Fund, but he is a soil carbon guy. He's working a lot on methane now as well. The EDF has a really great program focused on methane. So he was already in the climate space really early on. Very much a biophysical scientist, but he was really interested in the questions that I was asking and so forth, and very encouraging. And then I did a forestry master's, and then at Yale I went back, as I said, to anthropology. So I've always sort of toggled between these disciplines, and I think that helps. I mean, I have just an interest in understanding what other folks are doing, and how can we as social scientists help ask questions that are of interest to natural scientists. I think we have a lot of things to bring to the table.
No, completely. Yeah, I think, almost even the anthropology mindset, right? Where you're always trying to get out into a group of people who don't, or come from a different belief system beyond your own. It almost kind of primes you, right? To be able to go interact with people with different forms of expertise.
Yeah.
Another thing I think amongst a lot of anthropologists, particularly trained in the US, I found there's kind of an onus on individual work, right? Particularly as someone, I've just finished my PhD. So that was a long time of solo research.
Yeah.
Now I'm very excited to be part of a team of anthropologists at the University of Bologna. Do you have any advice for people who've been more used to kind of solitary work in terms of how to form collaborations on research projects?
Yeah, I think it's really crucial. If you look at my publications over time, the first couple of years out of my dissertation, it was all single authored things. And then my book was single authored. And I think for the last 5 years, I don't think I've published anything that's been single authored, maybe one thing. And they've been really interesting teams. I just signed off on a collaborative paper with a bunch of soil scientists the other day that we're doing for the Proceedings of the Royal Society journal. And so, but the question that was a special issue devoted to the question of, if we paid more attention to soil as being fundamental to trying to achieve the sustainable development goals and provide ecosystem services, what would we need to look at? And so that involved a lot of people who are, working on, soil carbon properties and water does soil retain and so forth. And I was asked to think about the ways in which soil is crucial to human identities. If you think about it, our artistic expressions involving soil. There's literature that takes soil as an actor. There's negative aspects of identities related to soil. If you think about all the sort of ethno-nationalist movements, right-wing movements in Europe and in the US, they often use the metaphor of blood and soil, like the sons of the earth, like this is our in-group. So there's all these metaphors about how soil creates these identities in both sort of positive and negative ways. And so my paper was about that, and they managed to weave that in with these other assessments in a way that I think was really integrative, which was nice. But that came out of having worked on the IPCC report with a particular soil scientist who got along quite well with me. And, we always have sort of side conversations like, well, what do anthropologists do about this? And that sort of led to being invited to be part of this other collaboration. So I think it's always a matter of try to keep an open mind, meeting people, even if you're not working on exactly the same things, at least know what each other, what these different groups are doing. I think it's great for anthropologists to go to other meetings, not just the AAA meetings, but maybe the AAS or the AGU, those are things that relate to environment. Other folks, might want to do other meetings, but I think that's a great space to find people for these sorts of collaborations that might take folks out of their comfort zone a bit.
And that's great advice. And I think also even just working on climate change seems to almost automatically or really support multidisciplinary collaborations, right? When you're really trying to tackle this wicked problem.
Exactly.
Where it can't, it's not going to be one discipline, it's going to be all of these different perspectives.
Yeah, that's right.
So another thing that really struck me in my kind of research in climate finance was, and also particularly working in an NGO that was trying to create a standard for land management and forms of material infrastructure connected to bonds, right, that were being marketed as providing investment towards environmental and climate change solutions. One thing that struck me was the different degrees to which people would be engaged or have direct experience with the landscapes that they were analyzing and writing about in offices in London or in these urban spaces.
Right.
So I'm very interested to hear, what interactions you've had with other IPCC group members and what struck you with the different backgrounds you've encountered and people's different, we've discussed a bit of the issues around economic perspectives sometimes dominating the discussion. What are the different levels of knowledge of both expertise and then also places that you've found interesting in your research?
Yeah, I think part of this is a function of different disciplines have different attitudes towards fieldwork. I've been trying to do as much field work as possible, although it's been impossible the last year, and then 5-year-old as well. So it's hard to do as much as I'd like. But some disciplines don't really reward that at all. And so to give an example, the paper I wrote for Economic Anthropology about integrated assessment models, a lot of the folks working on these models do not do field work, right? They're modeling in an office someplace, dealing with algorithms and data that's collected by other people, and they're plugging it into these models and coming up with these outputs. And they are completely disconnected from particular places. So, for example, one of the things that integrated assessment models try to do is, they're essentially trying to provide a sense of what the future is going to be in terms of maybe a future temperature target. So if we're trying to get to no more than 2 degrees by 2050, the models will tell us, what are some possibilities to do that. It'll give us some different pathways. And you can plug in, different parameters. You can say, give me a pathway where there's a carbon price. So it'll give you different results. But one of the things the models almost across, there's different ones, but in general, one of the things that they do is they assume that decisions on agriculture and whether or not farmers would be willing to, say, plant trees to sequester carbon are made 100% on the basis of commodity prices. And through all of my work in Vietnam and other places, commodity prices are one thing that go into a farmer's calculation. They are by no means the most important thing necessarily. And so a great example of this is Vietnam with rice production. In some places, it costs more to produce rice than they get for it. So to an economist, that is insane. They would not do that. They've done it for 20 years in my field site in Vietnam. And I'll sit down with them and do we'll run the numbers. And I'll say, by the time you buy fertilizer and by the time you figure in the days that you've devoted to labor and so forth, and then you sell your rice, you have lost money. And they're like, yeah, we know. because it's about food security.
Yeah.
It's about having food security, and it's about keeping a plot of land in production, because that potentially wards off other folks who, might try to use it, or, there's a sense of keeping land in production is a security issue for farmers. And so, and of course, how do you model that? Right? How would you put those sorts of calculations in a model? So a lot of these IAMs will assume that if commodity prices, if a ton of carbon is more than $50 a ton, huge swaths of farmers around the world are going to abandon what they're doing, oftentimes it's food production, and they're going to plant trees for biomass, which is then going to go into carbon and it's going to be combined with carbon capture and storage. So we're going to burn a bunch of trees, we're going to capture it with carbon sequestration, and that's going to be a negative emissions technology in the end. So this process is known as BECCS in the technical terms, but it's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And it's one of the only ways that these integrated assessment models actually can get us to temperature targets, certainly for 1.5. There's almost no pathways to 1.5 without using negative emissions, and BECCS is really the only one that's even slightly viable, which is pushing it because there's not really any examples of it yet. But my point is that is based on the assumption that a bunch of farmers will plant trees for BECCS because the commodity price will be high enough, and because there will be sufficient abandoned, this is a big category, abandoned land on which to plant these crops, these bioenergy crops. But the definition of abandoned land is land that is underused.
Yeah.
And it's like, any anthropologist will tell you, underused, there's a ton of reasons why people aren't maximizing commodity production on any particular piece of land. They can't afford the sort of high cost inputs that would go into highly industrialized agriculture in a lot of places. So the idea that everyone's just going to magically switch over to produce bioenergy, I mean, it's just the assumptions that go into some of these are just things that I think are not tenable in the real world. And so I would say these things. I would say, I have worked on the ground with farmers. I know what goes into making land use decisions, and you can't model this in such a simplistic way. And so I think that groundedness is useful for seeing the problems with some of these outputs and recognizing that, if BECCS is reduced to just what's the price of carbon, it is going to wildly overestimate the land availability. And so I said that repeatedly, and I think that got through to a lot of people because they agree with it. They know the modelers are not the problem. Actually, they're very well aware of the limitations of their models. It's policymakers who want a simple answer. They want a quick and dirty quantitative number that they can try to hit. And, so some of these assessment models become a tool to give a simple answer, and that's not really what they were designed for.
And I think that's a great example also of markets being the focus of analysis, both in the modeling and then in the projection, right? That both of those have different stages of divorce from reality or what people are actually thinking in their personal decision making. How has your perspective or your framing or thoughts on markets changed over your career?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in how do people make decisions about when and where to engage with markets, because particularly in Vietnam, when I started working, there wasn't necessarily a well-developed market economy. They were sort of coming out of this really highly regulated, very top-down economy where, people were telling me the stories about, queuing up for hours with coupons to buy food in cities and so forth. Thinking about the ways in which people choose to engage with some markets and then choose to not engage with other markets, I think it's been really interesting over time. And particularly in climate, I think there has been a hope that markets were going to be this panacea. I think that has sort of worn off. I think people are cognizant that there's going to be a whole suite of things that need to be done, of which market price signals can be important. But that's not the only thing. So a perfect example of this is, 10 years ago, everyone was saying we needed a carbon tax in the United States. I don't hear very much about that as the sole solution. I mean, I hear some people still saying, that would be potentially helpful to shift some investments to renewable energy. But I hear many more people talking about things like renewable energy standards. which you could argue is a form of, shaping the market, but it's much less dependent on the market setting the price signal in the same way that a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, for example, operates. And so I don't see, for example, a cap and trade system being on the agenda at all anymore, even though, Joe Biden as president now has said he's got these really ambitious climate change plans. I think they're going to be about regulatory initiatives as opposed to solely market ones. And I think that's the evidence backs that up, that markets have encouraged investment in some areas, but they have failed to shift the balance, particularly in terms of reducing carbon emissions, in ways that they promised, and they haven't, and their success rates have been less than those places that use regulatory means. So,
and going back, I mean, also I'm sure from your research in Vietnam as well, right, where you've seen the kind of the transformation.
Yeah.
I think in your dissertation, in your book, right, you talk about the kind of moves from French colonialism into the Vietnamese state and to the present. How do you view, or have your thoughts also changed on this kind of back and forth between the public sector, governments, also supranational entities such as the UN, and markets? Has your thinking shifted on that at all?
I don't think it's so much shifted as I've always been really interested in the way that policies are designed, and the assumptions that they make that are made and that go into policies. So in the case of French colonialism in Vietnam, the assumption was we are Europeans. There's a huge amount of ethnocentrism. We as French foresters have been managing the landscapes of France for 300 years with our advanced forestry techniques, and we can just pick them up and deposit them in Vietnam and they will work there. And of course, they failed miserably because they didn't take into account the differences in the structure of Vietnamese forests. Vietnamese forests are not Mediterranean forests. They have a completely different sort of materiality. And then, of course, it had that sort of paternalistic, we know best, went over very badly with all of the populations in Vietnam that were already there and had already long experience with managing forests in ways that were locally beneficial. So to have these colonial officials say, not only do we know how to manage forestry best, but we're going to manage it for the creation of revenue for the French colonial state, which these folks on the ground didn't want anyway, then it was just a recipe for disaster, of course. And so, and then moving forward to my dissertation research, which was around a protected area, it was very much the same thing. The folks in that part of Vietnam had been very strong supporters of the Vietnamese state during the Vietnam War. They were known as like the province that sent the most people to the war front, that were, very, very much engaged in the promise of building the Vietnamese state. But when it came to protected areas and managing them, when they were excluded, when local populations were excluded from decisions about the forest, they were understandably pissed off. And so they accepted state authority on some aspects, how to fight a war. They didn't accept it on other aspects, which is we've been here longer and we know how to manage these lands that could generate biodiversity and ecosystem services through human management, not through exclusionary means. So that sort of interplay that people have with policy, particularly when it's perceived as illegitimate, I think is really interesting. And I think there's probably not enough attention to the ways that markets can be seen in the same way, that markets can be seen as illegitimate, that people don't react to them just because the price signal says one thing or another. Certain things are beyond value, and that particularly when it comes to distributional issues and equity issues, those have to be taken into concern, and markets are very challenging to deal with that. And a great example of this is California's approach to climate change. They've been doing sort of cap and trade and carbon credits and things like that. And environmental justice communities in California have rightly pointed out that market-based system has nothing built into it to prevent the worst polluters, often situated in low-income and minority areas, from continuing to pollute, just buying their way out of it through carbon credits elsewhere, and disproportionately continuing the air pollution and other impacts in those areas. And they're absolutely right. If you actually look at the data from California, the carbon emissions reductions that have happened there have not happened in low-income areas, because there was no way to build justice and equity into a market solution in the way they did it. And that has to be on the table. That has to be part of the discussion. Otherwise, you will get folks who have not bought into the legitimacy of this policy.
No, completely. And I think that also shows a really clear angle where anthropologists can value, right, in terms
Yeah.
of really trying to break apart what are the elements or the kind of objects that have legitimacy
Mhm.
in different areas in society. And I think we can see, right, how within circles in the UN or in governments, markets have so
Yeah.
much legitimacy, it seems, around the world, but that there are lots of other ways that we could be organizing our societies, distributing resources
Yeah.
that have a legitimacy beyond the market. And, for a lot of communities, particularly groups that have less power
Yeah.
globally.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much for all your time, Pam.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
One last question I wanted to end off with was, I really enjoy in your symposium article your kind of call for economic anthropologists to engage more with these models that are really influencing policy discussions. And I think in this conversation, you've laid out really nicely, right, examples of how you've been able to bring in new perspectives into these spaces. Since you've written the article, have you had any other thoughts about what would be exciting for economic anthropologists to be doing, or any ideas for those out there?
Well, I'm still sort of thinking about how that can be done. And I think there's a lot of opportunity because modelers themselves are aware of their flaws. Like I said, they know full well that some of these parameters that they're trying to understand are far too simplistic. So I think they would welcome the input of anthropologists. And in fact, there was just an article in, I think it was Wire's Climate Change recently from somebody in the modeling community, basically saying, we have a real problem with the legitimacy, to get back to legitimacy, the legitimacy of integrated assessment models, because they are such a black box to anybody who is not in the modeling community. And they have been pressed for years to, for example, open up the code, have the code be publicly accessible, have like a easy to access site. I mean, some of these IAMs you can get into, and you can plug some numbers in. You can choose, I would like the carbon price to be this, and I would like the output year to be this, and so forth. But you don't know what the different components of the model, what algorithms they're using, what data went into that originally. That all remains very hard to understand. So folks in the modeling community are saying, if we want to be perceived as legitimate and not the sort of really closed off, inaccessible group of specialists who haven't shared their information and code and data and so forth, we need to do something differently. And so I think, to me, that's an opportunity for anthropologists to jump in and say, we're ready to help. Like, what can we do? I mean, I think that ranges everything from suggesting alternatives to IAMs. There are alternatives that are more qualitative. If we think about things like participatory scenario development, that's something where you get groups of people in a room and you talk about imagining futures together and what are the choices that would go into different pathways. And essentially that helps you think about what people value, what would people want to do if presented with a narrowing range of choices. So there's that, like suggesting alternatives to models, but then there's also, let's break apart some of the assumptions in some of these models. Let's make, for example, more realistic assessments about the availability of land, about the ways in which, let's not just assume that everybody's a utility maximizer. Let's have some more nuance around people's relationship to pricing, for example. So I think there's lots of opportunities. We'll see where it goes, but I think I'm optimistic that we'll be able to contribute something to it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So all of you economic anthropologists out there listening, there's lots of work to be done.
Absolutely.
Lots to do. Well, thanks so much again for joining us, Pam, and looking forward to future conversations.
Great. It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.